The neon lights of the bar flickered weakly, casting a sickly glow over the cracked pavement. It was the kind of place where time felt stuck, where the air smelled like stale beer and broken dreams, where every man in the room carried the weight of something unspoken. A forgotten corner of America, where the wrong kind of stare could mean trouble, and a man like Mike Tyson, especially a black man, was out of place. Mike didn't care. He had learned a long time ago that fear didn't serve him, that the only way to move through life was forward, fists clenched, mind calm. He had seen worse places, walked through darker alleys, and faced demons far worse than anything a rundown bar could offer. But still, as he stepped inside, he felt it, that shift in the air, that tightening of shoulders, that deliberate silence that always followed him into rooms where he wasn't welcome. He was dressed casually, jeans, a simple black t-shirt stretched over a frame built like iron. His face was instantly recognizable, though age had softened the sharp angles of youth. Still, his presence commanded attention. He wasn't just a man, he was a legend. And yet some people, blinded by their own ignorance, failed to recognize what was standing right in front of them. A few men at the counter glanced up, eyes narrowing. One of them, a wiry man with a long scar down his cheek, elbowed his friend and muttered something under his breath. The others chuckled lowly, exchanging glances filled with something between amusement and malice. Mike ignored it. He had heard it all before. The whispers, the quiet laughter, the smug little jokes that always carried an edge of hate. It didn't matter. He wasn't here for them. He just wanted a drink, a quiet moment to himself. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a grizzled beard, barely looked at him. "What'll it be?" he asked, voice flat. "Whiskey." "Neat." The bartender nodded and poured, sliding the glass across the counter without a word. Mike lifted it to his lips, savoring the burn as it went down. For a moment the world was quiet. Then the first shove came. It was subtle, almost casual. Just a light bump against his shoulder as one of the men walked past. An accident, maybe. But Mike knew better. He set his glass down slowly, exhaling through his nose. "Watch where you're going," the man muttered, his voice low and sharp. Mike turned his head, studying him. He was tall, lanky but wiry, with a smirk that said he was used to pushing people around. Mike didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man took a step closer, emboldened by the silence. "You lost, boy?" A ripple of tension passed through the room. The air grew thick, charged with something heavy. Mike clenched his jaw. He wasn't a kid anymore. He wasn't some scared teenager on the streets of Brownsville, forced to prove himself every second just to survive. He had nothing to prove. But some men didn't know how to leave things alone. Scarface stepped forward now, cracking his knuckles. "I think he's got the wrong place," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Maybe we should help him find his way out." The others chuckled. The bartender said nothing. The whole place was watching now, waiting, hungry for whatever was about to happen next. Mike sighed and pushed his glass aside. He had come here for a drink, but it seemed the night had other plans. The whiskey sat untouched on the bar, the condensation beating along its edges as the tension in the room thickened. Mike Tyson had been in places like this before, too many times to count. He had felt this energy before, smelled the arrogance in the air, the kind of ignorance that made men overestimate themselves. It was the same attitude he had seen in the alleys of Brownsville, in the broken men who swung at him out of desperation in underground fights, in the trainers who had doubted him before he ever became Iron Mike. He wasn't here for trouble. He was too old for that. The wild, reckless days of his youth were long behind him. The nights of street fights, the anger, the rage that had once defined him. He had worked hard to leave that man behind. But some nights the world had a way of pulling him back in. The man in front of him, Scarface, shifted his weight, rolling his shoulders like he was preparing for something. His friends weren't far behind, eyes flickering between each other with unspoken agreement. They thought this was going to be fun. They thought this was going to be easy. Mike exhaled slowly. He wasn't a young, hungry fighter anymore, but that didn't mean the old instincts weren't still there, sleeping just beneath the surface. He could feel them now, stirring in the pit of his stomach, that familiar hum of anticipation, the same feeling he used to get before stepping into the ring. But this wasn't a ring, and these weren't fighters. A voice echoed in his mind, one that belonged to someone long gone. Control the storm, Mike. You don't let it control you. Custamato's words had never left him. His old trainer, his mentor, the man who had believed in him when no one else had. Cus had pulled him out of the streets, out of the cycle of violence, and turned him into something more. A warrior. A champion. A man. But even champions had their demons. Mike swallowed, pushing back the memories. Now wasn't the time for ghosts. Scarface smirked, leaning in just enough to invade his space. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? His breath smelled of cheap beer and bad decisions. Mike turned his head slightly, locking eyes with the bartender. The man looked down, pretending to clean a glass, avoiding any responsibility for what was about to happen. It was clear now. This wasn't just a random bar. These men owned this space, ruled over it in their small, pathetic way. They didn't recognize him, or worse, they did, and they still thought they had a chance. A chair scraped against the floor, as another man stood up from the corner, cracking his knuckles as he joined the group. Maybe he's just slow, he muttered. Maybe we gotta spell it out for him. The air was electric now, crackling with the kind of tension that always came before a storm. Mike clenched his jaw. He didn't want this. He really didn't. But some men only understood one language. Before he could speak, a voice cut through the thick air. You boys really think this is a good idea? It was an older man, sitting alone in a booth near the back. He had the weathered look of someone who had seen too much, deep lines carved into his face, tired but sharp eyes, and hands that rested too easily on the table, like they had known violence before. Scarface turned, scowling. Mind your business, old man. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, tilting his head as he looked at Mike. I don't think you boys know who you're messing with. A flicker of hesitation passed through the group just for a second. Mike remained, silent, his face unreadable. Scarface scoffed, rolling his eyes. Yeah? And who the hell is he supposed to be? The old man gave a dry chuckle, shaking his head. You'll find out soon enough. For a moment, the bar was still. The gang of men exchanged glances, something unspoken passing between them. They weren't used to being challenged. They weren't used to doubt creeping in, but arrogance had a way of pushing past reason. Scarface took another step forward. I don't care who he is. Mike tightened his fist under the bar, feeling the pressure build in his knuckles, feeling the weight of everything. The years of discipline, the lessons learned, the rage carefully caged inside him. He could end this, right now. One punch, one clean, well-placed shot, and Scarface would be on the ground, out cold before he even knew what hit him. But that wasn't the way anymore. That wasn't who he wanted to be. Mike took a slow breath, steadying himself. Listen, he said finally, his voice calm but firm. I don't want trouble. Scarface grinned, mistaking patience for weakness. Yeah? Too late for that. The old man sighed, shaking his head, and then the first swing came. Mike saw it before it even happened, Scarface shifting his weight onto his back foot, his right shoulder dipping just slightly. It was sloppy. Amateur. He had seen better punches thrown by kids in the street. Mike didn't move. The fist came fast, reckless, full of confidence. And it missed. Scarface stumbled as his swing met nothing but air, his own momentum throwing him off balance. Mike had barely tilted his head to the side, just enough to avoid it, just enough to let the moment sink in. A flicker of panic crossed Scarface's face. And then the rest of the men moved. Chairs scraped against the floor. Boots stomped. The air shifted and suddenly it was no longer a game. Mike rolled his shoulders. So this was how it was going to be. He hadn't asked for this fight, but he wasn't about to walk away from it, not now. The moment Scarface's fist cut through empty air, Mike knew how this was going to end. It was inevitable. Some men couldn't be reasoned with. Some men needed to feel the consequences of their actions before they could understand the weight of their own ignorance. Scarface stumbled, his face twisting with anger and embarrassment. His friends tensed around him, their bodies coiled like springs, waiting for an excuse to explode. The bartender, still pretending not to notice, turned away, giving them unspoken permission to do whatever they pleased. Mike exhaled through his nose. It was always the same. The streets of Brownsville had taught him everything he needed to know about men like this, about the ones who thrived off fear, who mistook silence for weakness, who built their egos out of threats and violence. He had spent his childhood dodging men just like them, fighting for survival long before he ever stepped into a boxing ring, and now he was older, wiser. He had nothing to prove, but that didn't mean he would walk away. Scarface recovered, his lips curling into a smirk meant to mask his frustration. "Lucky dodge," he muttered, "but you ain't gonna dodge all of us." The others closed in. 5 of them now. Maybe 6. They thought numbers would change the outcome. It wouldn't. Mike stood slowly, pushing the bar stool back with the quiet scrape of wood against tile. His body moved with the kind of precision that only came from years of mastery, fluid, controlled. He rolled his shoulders, muscles stretching beneath his t-shirt, his knuckles flexing at his sides. Scarface sneered, misreading the movement. "What, you finally gonna fight back?" Mike stared at him, his dark eyes steady. "You don't fight with anger. You fight with purpose." Cuss's voice echoed in his mind, a memory from long ago, one of the countless lessons drilled into him in the cold, early mornings of the gym, long before the fame, long before the titles. A man who fights with anger is already defeated. A man who fights with discipline is unstoppable. Mike wasn't angry, not yet, but he was ready. Scarface lunged again, this time with more desperation. He threw a sloppy right hook, aiming high, reckless. Mike didn't even think. His body reacted before his mind could process. He slipped the punch effortlessly, moving just enough to let it graze past him. His left hand shot out, palm open, striking Scarface in the chest with a controlled push. It wasn't even a punch, just enough force to send him stumbling backward. Scarface's friend stepped forward, but something had shifted. For the first time, they hesitated. Mike could see the flicker of doubt in their eyes now, the unspoken question forming in their minds. Who the hell is this guy? The old man in the back booth chuckled under his breath. Y'all really don't get it yet, do you? Scarface's face was red now, a mix of humiliation and anger. You think you're tough, huh? His voice was sharper now, filled with something ugly. He wasn't just trying to prove something to Mike anymore. He was trying to prove something to himself. And that made him dangerous. Mike knew that feeling too well. He had lived it. The desperation of a man who feared losing control, who feared being seen as weak, was the most dangerous kind. Mike didn't want to hurt him, but he wasn't about to let himself be walked over either. Scarface reached for something. In his jacket, a knife. Mike saw the glint of steel before it was fully drawn. The room shifted, the air thickened. This was no longer a drunken scuffle. This was real now. Mike's heart pounded, not with fear, but with cold, practiced calculation. He had spent his life preparing for moments like this, in and out of the ring. Scarface grinned, emboldened by the blade in his hand. Not so tough now, are you? Mike's fingers twitched at his sides. He could feel it now. That old fire. That part of him that had never truly gone away. The fighter. The warrior. The man who had been built for this. But this wasn't a ring. No referees, no rules. No bell to signal the end. He had to end this before it got worse. Scarface took a step forward. Mike moved. It happened so fast that none of them saw it coming. A single step, a pivot on the ball of his foot, muscle memory taking over. His left hand shot out, knocking Scarface's wrist before the knife could be fully raised. A precise strike, just enough to loosen his grip. And in that same breath, Mike's right hand came up in a blur. One punch, a perfect, clean, devastating right hook. The impact cracked through the room like a gunshot. Scarface's body went rigid before he crumpled, his legs giving out beneath him. The knife clattered to the floor, forgotten. His friends froze. Silence. The entire bar was watching now. Scarface lay motionless, out cold, his body sprawled across the floor like a discarded puppet. The others stared at Mike, at the knife, at their leader, unconscious at his feet, and then, finally, recognition. Dawned in their eyes. One of them whispered, barely audible, "Holy shit, that's Mike Tyson." The room shifted. Fear. Real fear. The kind that seeped into a man's bones when he realized he had made the worst mistake of his life. The old man in the booth let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Took y'all long enough." Mike exhaled, shaking, the tension from his shoulders. The fight was over before it had even begun. He bent down, picking up the knife from the floor. With calm, deliberate movements, he folded the blade and placed it on the bar. Then he looked up, meeting the eyes of the remaining men. No words were needed. They understood now. One by one, they backed away. No apologies. No bravado. Just quiet, panicked retreat. Scarface remained on the floor, still unconscious, his friends too afraid to even lift him. Mike sighed, running a hand over his face. He hadn't wanted this. But maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what they had needed. The bartender, pale and shaken, finally spoke. "Drinks on the house." Mike glanced at his untouched whiskey, then pushed it away. "Nah," he muttered. "I'm good." With that, he turned and walked out, the night air cool against his skin. Behind him, the bar remained silent, filled with men who would never forget what had just happened. And Mike? Mike just kept walking, disappearing into the darkness. A legend, leaving behind nothing but ghosts. The night air was thick with tension as Mike Tyson stepped out of the bar. The distant hum of crickets filled the silence, but inside his head the world was far from quiet. The fight had ended quickly, too quickly, but it left behind something more dangerous than broken pride. It left unfinished business. He could feel it. The way the men had backed away, the way their eyes had darted between each other like they were already planning something. This wasn't over. Mike had spent years learning how to read a room, how to feel the undercurrents of violence, before they exploded, and right now that feeling was pressing down on him like a storm waiting to break. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he made his way toward his car parked a block down. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. His instincts screamed at him to stay alert, to watch for movement in the dark. And then, there it was, a soft shuffle of footsteps, too many of them. Mike didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he kept his pace steady, his ears tuned to the sounds behind him. He could hear their breathing now, uneven and shallow. More than one set of footsteps, maybe 3, maybe 4. They weren't done with him yet. A voice rang out from behind. "Where you going, tough guy?" Mike slowed to a stop. He knew that voice. Scarface. The idiot had gotten back up. Mike turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse without fully facing them. Scarface stood in the center of the street, still dazed, but angrier than ever. His jaw was swollen, his right eye already beginning to bruise. But the worst part? He wasn't alone. The others had come back, and this time they weren't empty-handed. One of them had a tire iron. Another held a length of chain wrapped around his fist. Scarface himself had something glinting in his grip. Another blade, longer, this time sharper. Mike let out a slow breath. They had learned nothing. Scarface grinned, his voice hoarse from the earlier hit. You think you're some kind of legend, huh? Just 'cause you got one lucky punch? Mike stayed silent. There was no point in talking. Scarface spat onto the pavement. That little stunt you pulled back there? Big mistake. The men spread out, now circling him like wolves closing in on a wounded animal. But Mike wasn't wounded. He wasn't even tired, and he wasn't trapped with them. They were trapped with him. One of them made the first move, lunging forward with the tire iron raised. Hi. Mike reacted instantly, shifting his weight and stepping inside the attack. The iron swung down, missing by inches as he twisted his torso, his right hand shooting up with precise, brutal efficiency. Crack. A sharp elbow to the nose. The man staggered back with a howl, dropping the tire iron as blood gushed from his face. Another one came from the side, swinging the chain in a wide arc. Mike ducked low, feeling the wind of the chain whipping past his ear. He didn't wait for a second strike. He surged forward, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The chain clattered to the ground. Mike drove a fist into the man's gut, knocking the wind out of him, then spun just in time to see Scarface rushing forward with the knife. Time slowed. Mike's body moved before he could think. His left hand shot up, catching Scarface's wrist mid-swing. The blade stopped inches from his chest. Scarface grunted, struggling to push the knife forward, his face contorted with fury. Mike held firm. Then, with a sudden explosive motion, he twisted Scarface's wrist outward, forcing the knife free. Scarface yelped in pain as the blade slipped from his fingers, and in the same fluid motion, Mike slammed his forehead into Scarface's nose. Crack. Scarface dropped like a sack of bricks. The remaining men hesitated, now their courage faltering as they watched their leader hit the pavement. Again. Mike stood over them, breathing evenly, his fists still clenched. Leave. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. One of them, still, holding his face from the elbow strike, nodded quickly. Yeah, okay. And just like that, they scattered. Scarface lay groaning on the ground, rolling onto his side, but even he knew it was over. Mike let out a slow breath, finally unclenching his fists. It was done. Or so he thought. A slow clap echoed from the darkness. Mike turned his head. A figure stepped out from the shadows, his silhouette tall, broad, a man in a long black coat, his face obscured by the streetlight behind him. Mike felt something cold settle in his stomach. This man wasn't part of the gang, but he had been watching. Not bad, the stranger said, his voice smooth, measured. Still, got some fight in you, huh, champ? Mike's eyes narrowed. Who the hell are you? The man stepped forward, revealing a face lined with experience. He wasn't young, but there was something dangerous about him. Something familiar. Someone who's been waiting a long time for this, the man said, his lips curving into a knowing smile. Mike's fists clenched again, but this time, it wasn't instinctual. It was deliberate. Because suddenly, he wasn't so sure this was over. Not yet. And for the first time that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A real fight was coming, a fight he might not walk away from. The stranger took another slow step forward, his boots clicking against the pavement. The sound felt deliberate, like he was giving Mike time to process his presence, time to understand that something was off. The gang was gone. Scarface was groaning on the pavement, beaten and humiliated. And yet, despite everything, this man wasn't afraid. Mike felt a ripple of unease crawl up his spine. Who are you? Mike repeated, his voice edged with caution. The man chuckled. That's the question, isn't it? He glanced down at Scarface, who was still groaning, cradling his nose. You did a number on these idiots. Can't say I'm surprised. His eyes flicked back up to Mike, sharp, assessing. It's been a long time, champ. Mike's brow furrowed. That word. Champ. Not tough guy, not big man. He knew. Mike's hands curled into fists at his sides. You've been watching me. The man tilted his head slightly as if amused. Long enough? The words carried a weight that sent warning bells off in Mike's head. He had dealt with all kinds of men in his lifetime: trainers, promoters, reporters, hustlers, gangsters. This man didn't fit into any of those categories. There was something controlled about him, something too measured. He wasn't just a bystander, he was a player, and he had just stepped onto the board. The man exhaled, reaching into his coat. Mike tensed, but the man merely pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with a flick of his lighter. He took a slow drag before speaking again. "You don't remember me, do you?" Mike's eyes narrowed. The man smirked. "Didn't think so. But I remember you, Mike. I remember everything." Mike didn't blink, didn't react. But inside, his mind was racing. Who the hell was this guy? The man exhaled smoke, watching him closely. "You ever hear the name Raymond Kane?" Mike's heart skipped. It was a name he hadn't heard in years. A name buried deep in the past, back when he was still fighting for everything. Back when he was just a kid in Brownsville, running with the wrong crowds. Raymond Kane. A name that sent flashes of old memories flickering behind his eyes. A name tied to one night, one mistake, a night that had changed the course of his life forever. Mike's jaw tightened. He did remember. Kane had been a local street enforcer back in the day, working for one of the neighborhood crime bosses. He was ruthless, feared. And one night he made the mistake of underestimating a young, desperate Mike Tyson. Mike had fought him in a back alley brawl when he was just a teenager, before Customato had saved him, before he had found boxing. Kane had tried to intimidate him, shake him down for money, push him around like he was nothing. But even then, Mike had been something else. Even then, he had been a fighter. And he had left Kane broken in that alley, his reputation shattered along with his ribs. That was the last time he had seen him, until now. But Raymond Kane was dead. Or at least, that's what Mike had been told. His blood ran cold. The man smirked at his silence. "You remember now, don't you?" Mike's muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at him that this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was revenge. "You're lying," Mike said, his voice low. The man shrugged. "Am I?" He stepped closer, and that's when Mike saw it, the scar. Faint but unmistakable, a long, jagged mark running down the left side of the man's jawline. The same scar Raymond Kane had gotten the night Mike put him down. The realization hit like a freight train. Raymond Kane wasn't dead. He was standing right in front of him. Mike exhaled slowly, steadying his breath. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "You shouldn't be alive." Kane grinned. "Yeah, well, life's full of surprises." Mike's fists clenched. He knew this wasn't over. Kane hadn't just shown up to talk. This was personal. Kane took another slow drag of his cigarette before flicking it onto the pavement. "I've waited a long time for this," he said. "A long damn time." Mike didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could feel what was coming. Kane took one last step, forward just within reach. His voice was quieter now, almost mocking. "You think you're still the baddest man on the planet, huh?" He chuckled. "Let's find out." And then, he swung fast. Faster than Mike expected, a straight right aimed right for his jaw. But Mike Tyson had spent his whole life dodging punches. He slipped the strike effortlessly, moving just enough for it to miss by inches. Then he countered, a brutal left hook to the ribs. Kane grunted, but he didn't go down. He was bigger now, stronger than before. This wasn't a street thug anymore. This was a man who had been training for this moment. Mike realized too late. Kane had been preparing for this fight for years. Kane recovered fast, faster than Mike expected. He lashed out with a quick uppercut, grazing Mike's chin. Not enough to do damage, but enough to warn him. This wasn't a bar fight. This was a war, and Kane wasn't here to prove a point. He was here to end Mike Tyson.